An avoidant doesn't confuse love with use. They confuse safety with attachment. An avoidant treats a placeholder as emotional insulation, not because they are malicious, but because insulation keeps the nervous system calm. A placeholder doesn't challenge their sense of autonomy, doesn't threaten their independence, and doesn't ask them to emotionally stretch beyond what feels controllable. Around a placeholder, the avoidance body stays regulated. Their breathing stays even. Their thoughts stay clear. The relationship feels simple, manageable, and emotionally efficient. That calmness gets mistaken for love, but it's not attachment. It's safety without depth. Someone they genuinely love creates the opposite reaction. Love doesn't feel soothing to an avoidant. It feels destabilizing. Their nervous system goes on high alert. They become hyper aware of the other person's presence, words, and emotional cues. Suddenly, there's something to lose. Suddenly, distance doesn't feel optional. It feels necessary for survival. This is why avoidants often describe deep connections as overwhelming or too much, even when nothing is objectively wrong. The threat isn't the person. The threat is the internal reaction that person activates. With a placeholder, they feel regulated. With someone they genuinely love, they feel exposed. Exposure for an avoidant isn't romantic. It's terrifying. It means being seen without armor. It means being affected. It means that walking away would hurt and staying would require emotional risk. Their body doesn't interpret this as intimacy. It interprets it as danger. So their system does what it learned to do early in life. It pulls back, shuts down, and regains control. This is where most people misunderstand avoidant behavior. They assume distance equals disinterest. In reality, distance often means the opposite. Avoidants don't withdraw because they don't feel enough. They withdraw because they feel too much without the tools to process it safely. The placeholder doesn't activate longing, vulnerability, or fear of loss, so the avoidant can stay present. The person they love activates all three at once, and the nervous system panics. Avoidants don't run from people. They run from how intensely their body reacts around certain people. When someone triggers emotional depth, attachment, hunger, or the possibility of dependence, the avoidant experiences a loss of internal control. That loss feels intolerable. So they reframe the connection, minimize its importance, or create distance to quiet the activation. This is why the person they love often gets mixed signals, inconsistency, and sudden emotional walls, while the placeholder gets steadiness and clarity. The core difference they never admit is this: placeholders make them feel safe without asking them to change, but real love asks their nervous system to evolve. And until that system learns how to hold intimacy without perceiving it as danger, the avoidant will always treat safety as love, and love as something they need to escape. If an avoidant is consistent, calm, and easy with you, that's not love. When an avoidant shows up smoothly, predictably, and without emotional friction, it often signals that the connection is functioning as a placeholder. With a placeholder, their nervous system remains undisturbed. There is no internal alarm, no push-pull, no sudden urge to withdraw. They text regularly because it doesn't cost them anything emotionally. Communication feels optional, not charged. It doesn't create anticipation or anxiety. It simply fills space. This consistency can look like care, but it's actually comfort. They make casual plans because casual keeps control intact. There's no long-term weight behind the interaction, no future-oriented pressure, and no fear of being emotionally needed. Plans stay flexible, light, and easy to cancel or reschedule. Everything is designed to preserve freedom. The avoidant can show up, enjoy the moment, and leave without carrying emotional residue afterward. That ease is the key indicator. The relationship doesn't linger in their body once it's over. Around a placeholder, they appear relaxed and present because nothing meaningful is at stake. There is no fear of loss, no threat of dependency, and no risk of emotional exposure. The placeholder doesn't activate longing because longing would imply need. They don't activate vulnerability because vulnerability would require surrender. And they don't activate loss because the avoidance sense of self doesn't feel tied to the connection. The relationship exists, but it doesn't attach. This is why avoidants can stay in placeholder dynamics for long periods without apparent conflict. The connection serves a purpose, companionship without entanglement. It allows them to experience closeness without intimacy. interaction without investment. They get to feel desired without feeling dependent. They get to feel chosen without having to choose deeply in return. From the outside, it can look stable. From the inside, it feels emotionally neutral. So they stay, not because they are bonded, but because their independence feels untouched. Their identity remains intact. Their emotional boundaries stay firm. There's no internal negotiation happening between closeness and autonomy, because autonomy never feels threatened. A placeholder fits neatly into the avoidance life rather than disrupting it. This is also why placeholders often receive better treatment. They get clearer communication, fewer mixed signals, and more reliability. But what they're receiving isn't emotional depth, it's emotional manageability. The avoidant isn't choosing the person, they're choosing the experience of not being activated. They're choosing the connection that doesn't demand growth, introspection, or nervous system discomfort. Understanding this reframes the confusion. Consistency doesn't always mean love in avoidant dynamics. Sometimes it simply means the connection is small enough to control. And for an avoidant, control feels safer than attachment, even when attachment is what they secretly long for, but don't yet know how to hold. When an avoidant loves you, they become inconsistent, not indifferent. This is the part that feels the most painful and confusing for the person on the receiving end. When an avoidant genuinely loves someone, their behavior often becomes unpredictable. They pull close, creating moments of deep connection, emotional intimacy, and apparent commitment, and then they disappear. Not dramatically, not always with a clear explanation, but subtly. Texts slow down, energy shifts, emotional access narrows. This isn't manipulation, it's nervous system overload. With someone they genuinely love, they open up in ways that surprise even themselves. They share personal thoughts, fears, and vulnerabilities they rarely let anyone see. In those moments, the connection feels real, grounded, and intimate. But once that openness settles into their body, fear follows. Vulnerability lingers. The avoidant becomes aware of how exposed they feel, and that awareness triggers shutdown. So they close off, retreat emotionally, or create distance to regain a sense of internal safety. They crave you, then resist you. Craving feels dangerous to an avoidant because it implies need. Need threatens their self-concept of independence and emotional self-sufficiency. The more they feel drawn to you, the more they fear losing control. That fear doesn't show up as honesty or reassurance. It shows up as hesitation, detachment, or sudden emotional walls. Their system is trying to protect them from a perceived loss of autonomy. This push-pull pattern isn't a lack of care. It's the opposite. If they didn't care, their behavior would be steady and neutral. Indifference is calm. Love is activating. Love destabilizes the avoidant nervous system because it creates emotional stakes. There is now something to lose, something to grieve, something that could hurt if taken away. Their body interprets this attachment not as comfort, but as a threat. For an avoidant, instability triggers withdrawal. When emotions rise, their system seeks regulation through distance. They don't yet know how to self-soothe while staying emotionally present, so they regulate by pulling away. That withdrawal restores a sense of control, even though it damages the connection. From the outside, it looks like mixed signals. From the inside, it feels like survival. This is why the person they love often gets less consistency than the placeholder. Love introduces intensity, and intensity overwhelms their internal capacity. The avoidant isn't choosing to be inconsistent. Their nervous system is choosing relief, and relief comes from creating space, minimizing emotional exposure, and returning to a state where they don't feel so deeply affected. Understanding this doesn't excuse the pain caused, but it explains it. When an avoidant actually loves you, the chaos isn't a sign you're unimportant. It's a sign you matter enough to disrupt their emotional equilibrium. And until they learn how to stay present inside that disruption, their love will continue to look like closeness, followed by disappearance, connection followed by retreat. Not because they don't want you, but because they don't yet know how to stay when love feels this intense. Placeholders get reliability. Real love gets resistance. This is the part that confuses most people and keeps them stuck questioning their worth. They look at how easily the avoidant showed up for someone else, how quickly they committed, how consistent they were, how clear the relationship seemed, and they assume that person must have been loved more. But in avoidant dynamics, better treatment doesn't equal deeper attachment. It usually means lower emotional stakes. Placeholders often receive faster commitment because commitment, when it's emotionally shallow, feels safe. The avoidant isn't committing to vulnerability or depth, they're committing to structure. A label, a routine, or a defined role can actually reduce anxiety when the connection doesn't activate the nervous system. It creates predictability without intimacy. So the avoidant can move forward quickly, not because their heart is invested, but because their autonomy feels protected. They show more consistency with placeholders because consistency is easy when nothing internal is being challenged. There's no internal conflict between desire and fear, no oscillation between closeness and self-protection. The avoidant isn't regulating intense emotions, so their behavior stays steady. Fewer mixed signals appear not because they're emotionally available, but because there's nothing emotionally complex happening inside them. This is why placeholders often experience fewer emotional highs and lows. The relationship feels smooth, functional, and even healthy on the surface, but underneath it lacks depth. There's limited vulnerability, limited emotional risk, and limited bonding. The avoidant remains in control at all times. That control is what allows the relationship to look stable. But this isn't emotional investment, it's emotional control. The avoidant is choosing the connection that asks the least of them internally. They're not being required to surrender defenses, confront attachment wounds, or tolerate emotional dependence. The placeholder fits neatly into the avoidant's life without disrupting their sense of self. And for an avoidant, that fit feels like relief. Real love doesn't offer that relief. Real love creates resistance because it demands surrender. It asks the avoidant to feel deeply, to stay present through discomfort, and to tolerate the fear of loss. That resistance shows up as hesitation, withdrawal, and internal pushback, not because the connection is wrong, but because it's powerful. So when you see an avoidant treat someone else better, what you're often witnessing is a relationship where they never had to emotionally show up in a meaningful way. They weren't challenged, they weren't stretched, they weren't exposed. The absence of resistance isn't proof of love, it's proof of safety without depth. This reframes the painful comparison. You weren't treated inconsistently because you were replaceable. You were treated inconsistently because you required more emotional presence than the avoidant was capable of sustaining. And until they learn that love doesn't have to mean loss of self, they will continue to choose connections that preserve control, even if those connections never truly touch them at all. They don't choose who they love, their nervous system does. Avoidants don't experience love as a simple emotional preference. They experience it as an internal conflict. On the surface, they may appear decisive, rational, or even detached. But underneath, their inner world is split between opposing needs that rarely feel safe to hold at the same time. This split shapes every relationship they enter and explains why their actions often contradict their feelings. Avoidants live in a constant tension between comfort and desire. Comfort comes from predictability, emotional distance, and self-reliance. Desire comes from chemistry, emotional intensity, and deep connection. The problem is that desire activates attachment, and attachment threatens the avoidant's sense of autonomy. So when desire appears, comfort disappears. What they want emotionally clashes with what their nervous system believes is safe. There is also a split between safety and depth. Safety for an avoidant means emotional control. It means not needing, not depending, and not being emotionally affected by another person. Depth, however, requires vulnerability. It requires allowing someone to matter enough to influence your internal state. When depth enters the picture, safety feels compromised. The avoidant doesn't experience depth as nourishment, they experience it as exposure. Then there is the split between control and attachment. Control is how avoidants regulate themselves. It keeps their emotions manageable and their identity intact. Attachment, on the other hand, introduces unpredictability. It creates emotional dependence, even if they would never consciously admit that word applies to them. Their nervous system associates attachment with loss of control, and loss of control feels dangerous. Placeholders soothe this internal fear. They sit on the safe side of the split. The avoidant can feel companionship without surrender, closeness without vulnerability, and connection without emotional risk. The placeholder allows the avoidant to maintain their self-image, independent, unaffected, and in control, Nothing about the connection forces them to confront their attachment wounds. Real love threatens their identity. It challenges the narrative they've built about themselves, that they don't need anyone, that they function best alone, that emotions are manageable when kept at arm's length. When someone breaks through that armor, the avoidant doesn't just feel love, they feel disoriented. Their usual coping strategies stop working. The version of themselves they rely on begins to crack. This is why avoidants don't move toward love in a direct or healthy way. They manage it, they regulate it, they ration closeness, pulling it in small doses and pushing it away when it feels like too much. They intellectualize feelings, downplay emotional significance, or focus on flaws to create distance. These aren't conscious games, they're survival strategies learned early, long before adult relationships. Managing love allows the avoidant to keep both sides of the split intact. They can experience desire without fully surrendering to attachment. They can maintain control while still staying somewhat connected. But the cost of this management is high. It creates instability, inconsistency, and emotional confusion for both partners. The avoidant remains divided, and the relationship never fully settles. Until the nervous system learns that attachment doesn't equal loss of self, this split will continue to dominate their choices. They will gravitate toward comfort, even while longing for depth, choose safety while craving intimacy, and protect control at the expense of connection. And that is the core tragedy of the avoidant pattern. They don't avoid love because they don't want it. They avoid it because their body doesn't yet believe it's safe to fully receive it. If you feel confusing, intense, and unstable, you're not the placeholder. This realization often lands uncomfortably because most people are taught that steadiness equals love and chaos equals dysfunction. In avoidant dynamics, it's often reversed. Placeholders feel steady because they don't activate anything deep inside the avoidant. The relationship stays calm, predictable, and emotionally contained. There's no internal struggle happening on the avoidance side, so the connection feels smooth on yours. Love partners, on the other hand, feel chaos, not because the love is unhealthy, but because the avoidance nervous system is activated. Activation creates fluctuation. One moment you feel deeply seen, chosen, and emotionally close. The next, you feel shut out, confused, and distant. This emotional whiplash isn't random. It's a response to how much the connection matters. If you've experienced hot and cold behavior, it wasn't because the avoidant didn't know what they wanted. It was because they wanted you and were afraid of what that meant. Hot moments came when they leaned into desire and connection. Cold moments came when fear surged and they needed to regain control. The switch wasn't about you, it was about regulation. If you've experienced sudden emotional walls, that wasn't emotional cruelty, it was a shutdown response. Emotional walls appear when vulnerability lingers too long. After moments of openness, closeness, or intimacy, the avoidance system moat becomes overwhelmed. Rather than staying present with that discomfort, they shut down to feel safe again. The wall isn't punishment, it's protection. If you've experienced deep moments followed by distance, that pattern is one of the clearest signs of genuine attachment. In avoidant dynamics, depth creates exposure. Exposure triggers fear. Distance restores equilibrium. The avoidant doesn't consciously plan this cycle. Their body reacts before their logic can catch up. And unfortunately, you feel the impact of that internal battle. This is why your experience may have felt intense, but unfinished. The connection never stabilized because the avoidant couldn't stay in one emotional state long enough to build consistency. When you were close, it felt real. When they pulled away, it felt like rejection. But the truth sits in between. That wasn't disinterest. That was activation. Activation means you mattered enough to disrupt their internal balance. You weren't interchangeable. You weren't convenient. You weren't emotionally neutral. You stirred something they weren't prepared to hold. And while that doesn't erase the pain of being pushed away, it reframes the story you tell yourself. Being the loved partner doesn't mean the relationship was healthy or sustainable. It means it touched something deep inside them, something unresolved. Placeholders don't create confusion because they don't create conflict. Love does. Understanding which role you played isn't about boosting your ego or clinging to hope. It's about clarity. If your experience felt intense, inconsistent, and emotionally charged. It wasn't because you were too much. It was because the connection was too real for someone who learned early on that real attachment comes with danger. And recognizing that truth is often the first step in reclaiming your power, not by waiting for them to choose you, but by choosing emotional safety for yourself instead. They don't lose placeholders. They lose the one who mattered. Avoidants rarely lose placeholder relationships in dramatic ways. Those connections often fade slowly or continue comfortably because nothing inside the avoidant is being challenged. Placeholders don't ask for emotional expansion. They don't trigger deep fears. They don't threaten the avoidant's sense of self. And because of that, they're easy to keep. The relationship can exist without requiring change. Real love is different. Real love demands growth, and growth feels dangerous to an avoidant nervous system. When someone truly matters, the avoidant is forced to confront emotions they've spent a lifetime managing away: dependency, vulnerability, fear of loss, and emotional need. These experiences aren't just uncomfortable, they feel destabilizing. Staying in the relationship would require learning new ways of relating, regulating, and trusting. And for many avoidants, that feels like stepping into the unknown without protection. Placeholders don't demand that kind of inner work. They fit neatly into the avoidant's existing emotional framework. The avoidant can show up without changing, love without risking, and connect without surrendering control. That's why placeholders are often kept. Even when they don't create deep fulfillment, they feel familiar, and familiar feels safe. Real love, however, exposes the gap between who the avoidant is and who the relationship requires them to become. It highlights unhealed attachment wounds and long-standing defenses. The avoidant becomes aware, sometimes unconsciously, that continuing would mean confronting patterns formed in childhood, where closeness may have felt unreliable, overwhelming, or unsafe. That confrontation can feel more threatening than the loss itself. So avoidants don't leave because love isn't there. They leave because staying would force them to face what they've been avoiding their entire life. Leaving restores emotional equilibrium. Distance brings relief. The nervous system calms, and in that calm, they often convince themselves that leaving was the right choice, that the relationship was too intense, not right, or not sustainable. This is why the person who mattered most is often the one who gets left behind. Not because they weren't valued, but because they mattered enough to disrupt the avoidant's internal world. The placeholder never created that disruption, so the avoidant could stay. Over time, this creates a painful pattern. Avoidants accumulate relationships that were easy to keep but never deeply satisfying, while losing the ones that could have led to real intimacy. The loss of real love lingers differently. It isn't loud or dramatic. It shows up quietly in comparison and regret, in moments where something feels missing but unnamed. Understanding this dynamic isn't about romanticizing loss or excusing emotional harm. It's about recognizing the cost of avoidance. Placeholders are kept because they don't ask for transformation. Real love is lost because it does. And until the avoidant learns that growth doesn't equal danger, they will continue choosing emotional safety over emotional truth, even when that choice means letting go of the one connection that truly had the power to change them. An avoidant doesn't treat you badly because you're unlovable, but because you're unforgettable. This is the truth most people never hear, and the one that changes how you carry the ending. The avoidance behavior was never a measurement of your worth. It was a reflection of how deeply you registered inside them. The placeholder was safe because it didn't penetrate their defenses. It didn't reach the parts of them they learned to guard. You did, and that's why the experience felt so different. The placeholder is safe. Safety to an avoidant means emotional neutrality. It means they can stay present without feeling altered, attached, or exposed. The relationship doesn't challenge their self-image or threaten their independence. It fits into their life without reshaping it. That kind of connection is manageable, it's calm, it's predictable. And most importantly, it doesn't ask them to feel more than they know how to handle. Real love is dangerous. Not because it hurts, but because it exposes. It exposes emotional need. It exposes longing. It exposes the truth that they are not as self-contained as they believed. When you came into their life, you didn't just offer connection, you mirrored back the parts of them that wanted closeness but didn't trust it. That exposure wasn't romantic for them. It was destabilizing. So they pulled away, they hesitated, They created distance to punish you, and not because you lacked value, but because staying close meant facing parts of themselves they had survived by avoiding. Avoidants aren't afraid of love itself. They're afraid of what love awakens inside them. And here's the tragedy. They often realize who they truly loved only after they've lost the person who stopped waiting. While the relationship is active, their nervous system stays in defense. Distance feels like relief. But once the bond is gone, the defenses soften. The body remembers. The absence creates clarity that closeness never allowed. That's when regret surfaces, quietly, not always consciously. They may not reach out. They may not confess. But comparison starts, memory sharpens. The connections that followed feel safe but empty. And in that contrast, the truth becomes unavoidable. The one they lost wasn't interchangeable. But this final truth isn't meant to pull you back into hope. It's meant to release you from self-blame. You weren't too much. You weren't difficult. You weren't unlovable. You were real in a way that challenged someone who hadn't yet learned how to stay. The moment you stopped waiting, explaining, or shrinking yourself, the dynamic ended. And while they may carry the realization later, your work is now different. It's not about being chosen by someone who couldn't stay. It's about choosing yourself, choosing steadiness, reciprocity, and a love that doesn't require you to be misunderstood in order to be felt. That is the real ending. Not their regret, but your freedom.